We know the names of some of the leaders. Peter and James were certainly leaders in that church. And the apostles were the teachers. The community participated in regular times of prayer. We hear of the apostles going up to the temple at the 3rd hour and the 6th hour for prayer in the temple of Jerusalem. And the brothers and sisters of the community of Jerusalem gathered in their own homes for the breaking of the bread and the prayers. Perhaps an early allusion to the Eucharist. Here's a pattern of life for an early Christian community that could be applied to any later Christian community. Stable, economically sound, a settled existence in a holy city with a nice temple. Who could ask for anything more? Over the centuries, many groups of Christian men and women had used the pattern, the life of the apostles in Jerusalem, as described in Acts, as the model for their lives. It was called the apostolic life, or the life of the apostles. It was supposed to mirror the community at Jerusalem in the Acts. Francis and Clare never talk about the apostles or the acts of the apostles as the pattern for their life. They speak about the gospel. They're talking about a different model of Christian life. If we think about it, quite different from what Luke describes in regard to the Jerusalem community. They're not trying to follow the example of the apostles in Jerusalem after Pentecost. Peter is wonderful. We love St. Peter. A little unreliable when you get into difficult times, okay. Seems to be afflicted by kind of chronic doubt at certain times in his life. Could be a little bit sneaky when he was eating with Gentiles, and then the observant Jews came around, and he pretended, no. Never had that pork burger, would never do that, no. And Paul has to come around, wag a finger at him, you were eating that pork and you know it. But the apostles, as wonderful as they are, were not the inspiration for Francis and Clare. Neither Peter, nor Paul, nor James, John go down the list. Yes, they're saints, but that's not who I'm here to follow. It's the life of Jesus. And the men and women disciples who followed him that we read about in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, those were the interesting people. This is a different kind of community. It experienced life as moving around from place to place. It didn't have community property holdings in Jerusalem or any place else. And in fact, this was a community, if we remember, was not very well received in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not a good place for Jesus and the disciples. But rather a group that moves along the borders of Jewish, religious, and political society. Preaching, teaching, healing, walking among the Samaritans and the tax collectors and the Gentiles and the lepers and the mad people, visiting the villages in the Galilee, starting out in all places in Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Can you see how this would seem a little bit dangerous? If you lived in a 13th century church society that liked order, because God is orderly, what we have as order in the church is what God has established. And that order is seen in the Acts of the Apostles. That's the pattern for Christian community life, so follow it. And these two people who never studied theology, who had never had any training in a religious community, one who sold cloth and thought he was going to become a soldier and then didn't, and this other kind of strong-willed, somewhat stubborn young noblewoman, that the two of them are going to teach the church a new form of, we really think this is a bad idea. They're nice people. They pray, they love Jesus, but they're wrong. They shouldn't live this way. They should live the life of the apostles, and in fact, we have a number of nicely approved rules, and we could just give them one to follow, including the rule of St. Augustine, which they tried. Didn't work. The rule of St. Benedict for monks. No. Thank you. The rule of, so-called rule of St. Bernard, the constitutions or the bylaws of the Cistercians. No. Cardinal Ugolino, who would later become Pope as Gregory IX, is pictured with Francis and a group of 5,000 followers in the year probably 1220 or 1221 on the plains below Assisi in a kind of Jesus camp-out down there, in which Francis and his brothers are trying to get their rule approved. They've been working for 14 years on this, and it hasn't quite gotten to the final redaction. And Cardinal Ugolino, who's an expert on getting religious communities organized, he's the one who's going to try to organize Clare, and doesn't work too well. He says, listen, we've got the rule of Augustine, we've got the rule of Benedict, the rule of Bernard, just pick one. They're already written, and you can get on with your life. You know, write some little clauses at the end to make it more specific for you, put a CZ at the end, and everybody will be fine. Francis, who was very respectful toward cardinals and popes and clergy and everything, takes Cardinal Ugolino by the hand, which is a lovely gesture, I think, and very Italian. Come on, Your Eminence. Gets him in front of the whole group there. And you can imagine the poor unsuspecting cardinal thinks, well, I finally talked sense into Francis. And Francis gives him a big smile and addresses the whole group, and he says, don't speak to me anymore of Benedict. Don't speak to me of Augustine. Don't speak to me of Bernard. The Lord has called me to be a new kind of fool in this world. And he will insist on that as he is dying in his testament, written at the very end of his life, where he will say, and you can almost hear this determined voice, he said, no one showed me how I should live. The Most High revealed to me that I must live according to the form of the Holy Gospel. And I had this written down simply and in few words, and the Lord Pope confirmed it for me. That's what we're celebrating this year, 800 years from its first approval. Adamant, absolutely adamant on this point, both he in his way and Clare in her way on the deathbed. Sign it, just sign it. Thought that this was really something worth sacrificing a great deal for. Church officials at the time really believed that the way of life described in the gospel was only meant to be lived during the years of Jesus' earthly ministry. After the death and resurrection of the Lord, the sending of the Spirit at Pentecost, that is, the birth of the church, the Acts of the Apostles gave the pattern for life in the church from then on. No turning back. The early life of the disciples and Jesus, that life on the road, in poverty, barefoot, traveling from place to place. They're always talking about washing feet. Why? Because their feet are always dirty, because they're always walking around. If they just stay at home, they wouldn't be dirty. That way of life, without any fixed source of income, without much structure, except the structure of the Master and the disciples, that's it, Jesus and everybody else, that brief span from the baptism by John in the Jordan to the time of the Lord's death and rising and the sending of the Spirit, that form of life was meant for that period of about 3 years. How long was it? Maybe 3 years. It was tough enough to live during that time. You couldn't do it longer than that. The community of disciples that existed before the church was born, that church before the church, was not meant to be a pattern for anyone after Pentecost. That's the church of Jesus and the disciples. What we are called to follow is the church of the apostles. Yes, of course, we should be inspired by the way that the early disciples lived with Jesus, but we're not meant to live that way today. Just get it out of your pretty little heads. That's not going to happen. This helps to explain why it took such a long time. For Francis, 14 years. For Clare, 40 years to get their rules approved. Francis did receive a kind of verbal approval by Pope Innocent III in 1209. So that's the reason for the 2009 birthday party going on here and elsewhere around the world. But it would take another 14 years until 1223 until he got the final stamp of approval on a very different kind of rule. Much briefer, bit more canon law in it, but still the essentials of the gospel. Clare, as we said, received approval for her way of life, patterned on the gospel, only on her deathbed, 1253. So the spirituality of Francis and Clare can be summed up in that one expression: to live according to the gospel. But in order to do that, we always are going to select. We're always going to emphasize. And I think when we look at Francis and Clare, we see certain aspects of the gospel that spoke to them most strongly. The first remarkable thing is that Francis has very little interest in context in the gospel. All those stories that kind of set up the scene, the disciples were walking along, and as they came across a fig tree one day, one of them was saying to them, he kind of skips over that, fast forwards to where Jesus is speaking or doing something. Then, pay attention. He's very interested in the words of Jesus. It's not the way that we approach Scripture today, but he really took these as quotations that were pretty close to what Jesus said. He didn't have any doubts about, he didn't have any higher criticism. He's not doing Scripture study in an academic sense. He looks for the words of Jesus, and he really takes those seriously. An Italian scholar named Carlo Paolazzi has done an analysis of the words, the vocabulary in the writings of Francis. And he comes up with an amazing statistic. This is by computer generating word forms as they appear in Francis and as they appear in the text of the Gospels as it was translated into Latin in his days. Something like 85 to 90% of Francis's vocabulary is taken from words that are spoken by Jesus in the Latin text of the Gospel. Which means that even in his speaking and his writing, Francis is trying to limit himself to words that are spoken by Jesus in the New Testament. That demands terrific control of your vocabulary. The other piece that he's very interested in is what he calls the deeds or the footprints of the Lord. These are wordless gestures of Jesus. These are the acts of healing, the acts of washing feet, for example. These gestures that are full of symbolic significance. And Francis really pays attention to them and tries to do similar gestures himself. As if performing these gestures somehow allows him to get inside the skin of Jesus, using the vocabulary, the words, and the actions, the deeds of Jesus. He's coming to kind of understand who this person is from the inside, and seems to come to understand himself by doing it. For both Francis and Clare, this kind of intense, laser-like focus on the person of Jesus, almost to the exclusion of everybody else. Rarely a quotation from St. Paul. Rarely a quotation from the letters of St. John. The second letter to Peter gets quoted a couple of times. St. James' epistle once. Book of Revelation a couple of times. Almost everything is focused on Jesus and his words. And that focus leads them to emphasize poverty.